Hey fearsome friends, got some gruesome stories for you tonight of murder and mutilation, my favourite kind. I want more of these. So lock up your house, get cozy, comfy, warm, and remember, keep being creepy. From the time I can remember, my great aunt always looked like she'd been to hell and back. Her milky white eyes and heavily deformed face always left me wondering what had happened to her. She was the sweetest old lady, always giving us candy and shooting out her dentures into her hand to scare us. Fun times. After she passed away, I asked my dad what the reason for all her scars were, and the story he told me was horrifying. In her mid-20s, her life was going well. She was not born blind, nor was she deformed, but this was the result of a horrific car crash late one night as she was returning from work. I'm not sure whether she'd dozed off or hit a deer, but whatever the case, the accident must have been brutal. It being the 1960s didn't help either, as the cars were basically rolling coffins. After the crash, she was declared dead and brought to the morgue. She remembered waking up in a cold metal box, and she couldn't move any part of her body except her feet due to the extreme injuries she'd sustained earlier. She began thumping her big toe against the edge of the box, but it was no more than a light tap. After a few hours, she heard muffled whistling as the night janitor made his rounds, mopping and sweeping. He must have totally crapped his pants when he heard the thumping coming from the row of metal boxes. She was taken out and soon recovered, except she was blind for the rest of her life. Now this story scared me, because you never know how competent those who may find you at a crash scene are. I know it was the 60s, but who knows if this could still happen today? This story has always been on my mind every time I cruise a lonely dark road late at night. Stay safe out there, friends. In the late 90s, around the Puget Sound area, there was a train tunnel that stretched for about a mile from one side of the peninsula to the other. We would frequently walk through it, because 1, it was off limits, and 2, it was pitch black for 80% of the walk. Trains would barrel through, emitting such a sound that would rumble through your whole body. You would have to go to one side of the tracks and hold on to the cold, damp cement wall while the train passed. On the other side was a secluded, beautiful view of the waterway, and local teenagers and young adults would walk through and usually party there. Just a bit further was a small campsite that I'm assuming was used by the homeless and train hobos. One summer we decided to camp out and do what teenagers do. We set everything up, started a fire, and began our night of revelry. As we began to unwind and turn in for the night, we noticed as the fire started to dim that there was a large man standing just beyond the firelight. We were startled and began to yell out, "Who's there?" among other things, and the man approached us slowly and walked to the campfire. He gave us his name and claimed to be camped just a little further down the tracks. We all knew at this point that he was homeless and also suffered from some mental illness. He gave us all the creeps, and we all had bad feelings about him. He would endlessly ramble about nonsense and told horror stories of being a transient along the train tracks. Eventually the fire died down and the beer stopped flowing, and the homeless man drifted back to his camp. Now we didn't sleep very well, or at all, that night. Now fast forward about 2 years, and long story short, I was arrested at my 21st birthday party for being intoxicated in public. Go figure. I was enjoying my slumber on the county-provided bedding in my cozy cell when I noticed that the guy in the corner, talking to himself, was the homeless man from years ago. Still a little buzzed, I approached him and asked him how he was. He was a bit disheveled, but after a few minutes of talking, he took a dark turn and said, "You kids don't know how lucky you are. I was watching you for hours, and I was about to chop you all up." The remainder of my stay at the jail was a bit unnerving, and I was lucky to be released early the next morning. I'm not sure if he was pulling my chain, but the feeling we all had that night when we'd first met, and the feeling I had at our next encounter, left me to believe that we truly were lucky to be alive. This happened a long time ago, around 2006, and I can't have been older than 4 years old at the time, yet I vividly remember the fear I felt during this encounter. It was an early summer morning, and the sun was up, but few people were out. In fact, the streets were practically dead that morning. My mum decided to take my sister, only one at the time, seated in a stroller, and I to throw away some garbage at the garbage station. Might I add that the garbage station was kind of secluded from nearby houses, bordering one of those deep, dark forests of eastern Sweden. Now, since I was only 4 when this happened, the memories from the incident have faded a lot. However, my mum remembers all of it. She says that upon entering the garbage station, she immediately got an eerie feeling of being watched. I remember that feeling too. I felt creeped out, even though I didn't know why I was scared, but I guess I could sense my mum's fear. Walking along that secluded garbage station, my mum suddenly stopped and said, "Jenny, hold on to the stroller as hard as you can and don't let go, no matter what." That's my only real vivid memory that I have of this, and I don't think I'll ever forget those words. I'll at least never forget how they made me feel. It was as if my blood had turned to ice. I just froze. My mum sounded stern, but even a toddler can sense when someone's scared, and my mum was definitely afraid of something. The rest for me is just a blur, and I don't remember much, apart from the aforementioned, so I'll let the rest of the story be told from the perspective of my mother. This is the recollection of her experience, recalled to the best of my abilities, but in my words. Not far from where we were standing, a truck was parked with a man seated in the front. Nothing unusual. A lot of truck drivers stopped to rest by the side of the road, but this man was staring, and he wouldn't stop staring. He stared right at me, examining my body with the determined gaze of a predator. Gluing the 3 of us in his sight, he truly seemed pleased by the fear he'd instilled in our faces. And his eyes, they were something else. Almost as if they didn't belong to a human, but rather to a predator on the savannah. I felt like prey stuck in the claws of a lion. I just couldn't move. And that's when he smiled at me. I remember that dead smile. Those cold, calculating eyes, and the way he licked his lips, almost as if to say, "I could kill you if I wanted to." I believe this was the point in time, into this strange encounter, when my mum told me to hold on to the stroller, to hold on tightly, and to not let go. Now, my mum is a small woman, 160 centimeters, and weighing only about 45 kilos, and she could easily have been overpowered by the overweight man in the truck. My mum later admitted she was afraid he'd jump out of the truck and knock her out, possibly assaulting her, or even kidnapping me or my 1-year-old sister. We bolted out of there, and we didn't throw away much garbage that morning. We just turned around and walked home as fast as my mum could do with a stroller and a 4-year-old toddler by her side. We've never talked about what happened that day, up until very recently. This incident has always lingered somewhere in the back of my mind as that weird thing that happened when I was a child, and every time I walk past that garbage station, I get a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. As previously mentioned, this happened around 2006. Fast forward to 2008, and the face of a 10-year-old little girl called Engla was printed across the front page of every newspaper in sight. She had been abducted, sexually assaulted and murdered, and the perpetrator was an overweight truck driver named Anders Eklund, now known as one of Sweden's most infamous killers. Anders Eklund was charged with the murder of Engla, alongside the rape and murder of a woman named Pernilla. He's also suspected of abducting another little girl, who's still missing, making him a paedophile, a serial rapist, and a serial killer. My mum says that when she saw Eklund's picture in the paper, especially when she saw those cold, familiar eyes, she knew he was the creepy man from the garbage station that early morning all those years ago. Thinking how my mum or my sister or me or all of us could have been his victims sends chills up my spine. So this happened well over a decade ago, whilst I was at uni. I'm not going to tell you where this was, but if you are from there, you'll probably know or have heard of this person, and when I get into the background, you might realise it's connected to a pretty awful story that happened in my country. So to give some further background, binge drinking was a thing back when I was young. Not only that, I was a young woman, coming from a town that was well known for its women binge drinkers, and I was moving to a town that was known for its hen parties for uni. I didn't have the best examples of safe drinking, but it explains why in Freshers' Week on my second year of uni 10 years ago, I was stumbling around some random streets of the town. Suddenly sobering up, I realised I had left the backstreet dive bar we always drank in, and gotten myself very lost on my way to another nightclub that I was supposed to meet my boyfriend at in a different part of town. It was cold and windy as I was ringing my boyfriend, but it's Freshers' Week, and he's a fresher, and he's at a very loud and popular nightclub on his first week of uni, so there was no way I was going to get through to him easily. I looked around trying to figure out where the hell I was, but was completely wasted. It's worth noting at this point as well that although I was 19, people were shocked when I told them this, as I actually look around 15, 16 years old, and because I'd considered myself an artist at the time, I dressed pretty oddly, which made me look even younger. So there I was in the middle of the night, drunk, in a dress, and of course no coat, even though it was near winter, because that was just not done on a night out. And I'm stumbling around, looking confusedly at my phone, and clearly lost, when suddenly a taxi pulled up. It had a taxi light on the top of the car, and the guy was waving me up. He asked me what was up, so I just started explaining my predicament. I figured I could just get a taxi to where I needed to be with no more trying to figure out where I was and trying to get across town in this state. I told him the name of the nightclub and that I have money. Then I texted my boyfriend to tell him that I'll see him in 10 minutes, but he's still not even checked his phone. I got into the taxi, and it was nice and warm and it felt safe, and taxis are safe, right? So because of the warmth, I started feeling a little drunk again. The taxi guy told me to get into the front, which is pretty odd for where I'm from, but I'll be out in 10 minutes, and this absolute ridiculous situation I've gotten myself in will be over. So I got in the front. All's fine. Weird, but fine. I texted my boyfriend again and started getting comfy, trying to feel drunk again because otherwise my night is getting more and more expensive, when taxi guys started asking me questions. I didn't really pay much attention at first, because, you know, taxi guys ask questions, especially when you're clearly lost and very, very drunk. I was starting to zone out, when he then asked me what year of school I was in, which is a wild question any way you think about it, because why would that matter? I laughed and explained that I go to the local university, and throw in there that I'm meeting my boyfriend, because this guy is giving me really weird vibes at this point. He assumed I was a fresher, i.e. new to town, and I didn't bother to correct him, because why would I? I'm bouncing out of here soon and this will all be over. I'm not new to the town itself, and it's a fairly small town. Even though I go to uni with people all over the world, some people just grew up here, so local gossip is known, especially when it's crazy. I was beginning to feel more on edge by his questions, and I've realized that I didn't like the way he kept looking at me. I still don't recognize where we are, even though I should by now. The part of town I should be heading towards is much closer to where I have been living the past year. I had my phone in my hand and was explaining that I was going to try my boyfriend again so he can meet me outside. He must have realized by now that I was weirded out by him. But if he was so calm about it. He really didn't seem to care. He started bragging to me about certain stuff, like his money and businesses. Then he told me that he owns a kebab shop. Well, he doesn't say that exactly. He told me the name of the kebab shop that he owns, and my heart dropped into my stomach. I have sobered up completely now, and I'm full of adrenaline. I know this kebab shop, because a girl had gone missing, presumed dead. She was a school-aged girl, and the last place she was seen was that kebab shop. I'm also very suddenly realizing that this supposed taxi doesn't even have a meter. So the story going around town is that school-aged girls would go into this kebab shop and exchange sexual favors for food and sometimes drugs. This isn't even really a debated part of the story. It's taken as fact. This is a poor area, and these kids don't really have parents, not ones that actually cared about their well-being anyway, and is kind of unexpected for my country, I suppose. But this town was absolutely rife with this kind of thing. This is why the missing, possibly dead girl was at his kebab shop that day. She was known to go there and trade sexual favors for cocaine and food. The next part, though, is what is up for debate. This is the gossip part, but is what people in the town believe is the truth. It's worth noting that even now, in 2021, no one has been convicted for this girl's murder, and she is still technically missing as far as I know. He, the man I was in a car with, a car I now know is definitely not a taxi, was accused of killing this girl, and the reason that she was never found? He ground her up and sold it as kebab meat. Insane, I know, but at the very least I knew 3 things were true. She was missing, she was known to sell herself to this man for food, and he was the last person she was seen with. And at the very least, he made jokes to various people in town that he had turned her into meat and sold her. And I was in a car with him, not a taxi. After he'd said the name of the kebab shop, everything moved so quickly, but also slowly at the same time. My phone had gotten through to my boyfriend's voicemail. When did I start calling him? And I suddenly decided the best thing to do was to pretend he'd answered. I left my boyfriend a voicemail of over 15 minutes. God knows what I even said. We never did listen to it afterwards. And taxi guy, no, kebab shop guy, was babbling some crap while I was leaving this absurdly long message. I was talking repeatedly about how I would see my boyfriend soon, and how we can't be that far away, and I just hoped this would make him drop me off. I'd started thinking about how I was going to break the window, as the doors were locked, and how I hoped I wouldn't be made to pay for it if I did. But then I suddenly started to recognize where we were. We'd gone a different way, but we were right near the nightclub. He slowed down, I got out. We didn't say anything to each other, and he didn't ask me to pay him. I guess he'd given up on pretending to be a taxi at that point, so I shut the door and he drove off. As soon as I was on the gross pavement outside the nightclub, I was so relieved. I'd never been so happy to see it. But the next thing I knew, someone was grabbing me and pulling me over to a car. I absolutely crapped myself. But thank goodness, it was the police. He was pretty pissed off with me for getting into the car in the first place, asking me what the hell I was thinking, etc. I explained to him that the kebab shop guy had told me he was a taxi, and that's how I learnt how to check for taxi licenses, because this very grumpy police officer told me to from then on. What happened was that because of the fact that the police had nothing on this guy, and as far as I understand they brought him to court and there was not enough evidence, i.e. no body, they had taken to following him when they came across him at night, just in case they caught him doing something suspicious. And that's probably what stopped me from turning into Kebab, or likely being raped that night. The police following Kebab guy freaked him out enough that he took me where I'd asked to go and left before he could get into trouble. I gave the police a terrible statement between tears because my bloodstream was just alcohol and adrenaline at this point. They became very annoyed with me and handed me back to my boyfriend, who had finally checked his phone and decided to come outside. I then explained to my friends the absolute insanity of what had just happened to me, whilst chain smoking a load of cigarettes in the smoking area. This is kind of a fun story I tell to dates now, but at the time, it was this actually mundane insanity, calm terror, and not a good freshers' night out overall. Now, I don't know if this guy was just mentally disturbed and kidding, or if he was actually malicious and failed. I was maybe 16 years old at the time, and I was a bit of a rebellious kid. I joined Tinder to meet some older guys, and I matched with this really attractive 20-year-old that seemed really into me. Naive, I know. He asked to pick me up from school the following day to get ice cream and walk around a nearby lake. I said yes. So he got me from school, and we had a great conversation. Nothing weird, and it seemed like we really enjoyed each other's company. When we got to the lake, no one was there because it was the middle of October and cold on the water. We walked about halfway around the lake, and that's when it started to get weird. He started talking to me about crime documentaries and how he'd studied them and knew how to kill someone without getting caught. He started making tracks in the mud and said that he would want to wear 2 big shoes so the police couldn't match him on shoe size. He then picked up his shoe to show me a size 10.5 and informed me that he wore an 8. This made me feel really uneasy. He was strolling around me while I was sitting on the bench, like I was prey. He then walked over to one of those dog baggy dispensers and pulled one off. He sheathed it up to his elbow and started swatting it in my face. I thought he might be trying to gross me out, so I was half giggling and swatting it away. But on one of my swats, he grabbed my forearm, pulled me in and put the bag over my head. I still thought he might be kidding, but as I tried to get away, I noticed that he wasn't letting up. I was starting to panic now, realizing I wasn't getting any air, and he picked me up in a sort of headlock position. I was kicking and thrashing my elbows, and I guess one of those elbows luckily connected with his groin, and we both fell to the ground. He laughed and said, "You got more fight in you than I thought you did. Was just going to make you pass out, but I didn't even get that far. I'm proud of you." All of my stuff, phone, taser, etc., was in his car on the other side of the lake, so I decided to play along and pretend that it was funny. I told him I needed my inhaler now and to walk me back. He did, surprisingly. I got in his car and grabbed my taser and phone out while he walked around the back of the car to his driver's side. I texted my mum SOS and to track my location. When I looked up from my phone, I noticed that the guy had pulled out a pocket knife. He slowly laid the tip into my chest, just enough for it to almost pierce skin, and he just blankly stared at me. This went on for about 30 seconds, and I don't know why, but I then said, "You're not going to do it." This seemed to snap him out of it, and he paused, and then hysterically laughed. Between laughs, he managed to say, "That's the second time I could have killed you today." The whole drive home, he proceeded to tell me about how he would have raped and mutilated my body if I had accidentally died that day. I got home and bolted out of his car, and as soon as I did, he sped off. I got a dick pic later that night from him, and then he blocked me. I looked him up, and it turns out he was actually 27 years old and had a criminal record for domestic violence. That's all I could get on him though, I reported it to the police, but nothing came of it, probably because I wasn't willing to tell my parents what had happened. Either way though, it was the worst encounter of my life. In February of 2012, I went to visit my grandfather's grave for his birthday. His death was a really hard thing for me to deal with, as he had died in March of 2011 and was still very fresh to me. I was kneeling in front of his grave with my head down, mourning and crying, when my body went into full-on danger is close by mode. I looked up to see a man running at full sprint from the woods surrounding the cemetery, and forced myself to get to my truck as quickly as possible without the man being able to get too close to me. By the time I'd made it to my truck, he had gotten about 50 feet from me, so I jumped in and locked the door, much to his apparent displeasure. He threw his hands up in a huff like his favourite team had just lost a football game. I started the truck and started to drive out as fast as I could, but not before driving right past him. I didn't break eye contact for a second, and neither did he, so I managed to get a really good look at his face. Fast forward to a few years later when I was at work, bored, so I decided to download an app that had a ton of paranormal, cryptid, serial killer and UFO articles. As I was browsing through the serial killers section, I came across one that made my heart drop into my ass. Israel Keyes, most known for murdering an underage girl in Alaska, dismembering her body and dropping the pieces into a frozen lake. He would bury kill kits in places long before he ever committed the crimes. After the incident in Alaska, he had travelled into Texas for a wedding in a city not too far from where I live, and had disappeared for a bit, and no one in his family knew where he was. He was arrested in that city and brought to the prison one city over from mine before he was extradited back to Alaska to stand trial. About a year ago, I found a book about him that provided a lot of the details I had given here. He had been killing for years, and no one knows what the actual death toll is, and he eventually killed himself in prison. At the end of the book, he described some of his favourite places to abduct people, public parks and cemeteries. I often wonder if there's a kid buried in the woods where I saw him running out of that day. You were fast, Israel, but I was faster. In the mid-90s, my mum and I lived in Malaysia, while my dad was in the UK studying for his medical exams. I was a toddler, so I don't remember many details of our home, but our photos tell me it was idyllic and backed onto a forest which proved a popular playground for the local kids. As it was just my mum and me, she often had to get my babysitter to come look after me while she was working at the hospital. I recall rather liking my babysitter, and by all accounts she was very fond of me. However, she was only a teenager at the time, so she also had other responsibilities, and at that point I'd proved myself a bit of a scamp, as I was a woman about town on my trike, zooming around in the forest with the other kids. This is why my mum would sometimes ask the hospital creche to care for me so she could pop in a few times a day. I believe this is where my mum met her friend. Mum's friend was a doctor at the same hospital. They had both emigrated from India at similar times, and they bonded over this experience. According to Mum, she seemed nice, if not a bit overzealous when venting about her ex. She took a shine to me, as she had children back home of a similar age, so she'd often come over for a cup of tea and a chat and bounce me on her lap. A few months down the line, her demeanour started to change. The previously flippant but forgivable behaviour began to deteriorate. She was beyond simply being tardy and eccentric. It was alarming. One afternoon she came to chat with my mum over a cuppa, and everything seemed perfectly pleasant. After a while, she gazed at my mum with a beaming smile. She said she had something to show her and that it meant a lot to her. It was deeply personal, but she felt like she could trust my mum, so she wanted to share it with her. She reached into her handbag and showed my mum a small box. When she opened the box, my mum couldn't quite understand what she was seeing, but then it dawned on her. It was a vertebra, a single human vertebra. The bone had belonged to her late mother, with whom she was very close. She went on to explain how her mother was the only person to not have betrayed her, and that she finds herself falling victim to despicable men. My mum could feel that she was becoming increasingly intense and agitated as the conversation progressed, and eventually it crescendoed with her condemning her ex for abandoning her in a foreign country. She was spitting, her voice rash from screaming about him and how he deserves a slow death. It was at this point my mum decided that was enough and tried to calm her down and said her goodbyes. Now Mum's friend didn't turn up for work the next day, or any day after that. According to the secretaries, she had just gone AWOL. It wasn't until a few years later that my mum had realised what had happened. By 2001, we were back with my dad and settled in the UK. Mum often keeps in touch with the friends she made during her stints practicing medicine abroad, and on one such day 20 years ago, she received an email. One of the secretaries she had worked with in Malaysia sent an email containing a link to a newspaper article. It detailed the unfortunate news of a suspected suicide which had taken place locally. A woman fitting the description of Mum's friend had taken her own life from the top of a residential building. It had a picture that bore a striking resemblance, but it was the text that followed making her blood run cold. The article stated that the police in India had been on a manhunt for the woman who they suspect is the deceased. The reason being, she had flown to India 5 years before and lured her ex to a rendezvous. There they believe she poisoned him before dismembering his body into small pieces over the course of 3 hours. The smallest parts were disposed of using a toilet, while the larger body parts were put into a suitcase. She spent the next few days hiring a taxi to visit remote locations where she would dispose of various body parts. The alarm was only raised when the taxi driver, on her final journey, detected the rancid smell of decay emanating from the suitcase. He tipped off the authorities and it resulted in her imprisonment. A few years later into her incarceration, the woman jumped bail and fled. The police manhunt resumed, but the trail eventually went cold after it was suspected she'd fled back to Malaysia. With no further leads, the case went cold. That is, until 2001. For one reason or another, the police have yet to make a conclusive identification on the body of the suicide victim. So while there is every chance that she is the woman who fell, there is also a chance that she isn't. I'm a 22-year-old male, live in a large city in the Midwest, and I drive for Lyft while putting myself through trade school. It was Christmas Eve 2020, and I was out running Lyft for a few hours before heading to my mum's with my new baby and wife. Nothing special was planned for the night, it was just the usual. I got a ride request. It was a pickup from this kind of lower-income apartment complex, no big deal. I arrived and find my passenger, and he has all his belongings, several boxes of stuff. Now my car is a 2006 Chevy Impala, so it's not very big, but we managed to get all his stuff loaded up, barely, and we were on our way. During the ride, he started crying, saying that his girlfriend was cheating on him, and he had just walked in on them earlier that night. He couldn't stay there because it was her name on the lease, so I was taking him to a hotel. Now, in my city, we have a street that is well known for having vices. Hookers, drugs, gangs, weapons, and shady motels. The works. Once we'd arrived at the motel, he asked me to wait for him to check in and get his key. "No problem, man," I said. I'll confess I break the rules a little when it comes to Lyft. I have a gun hidden in a concealed holster, secured to the underside of my driver's seat for protection. Reason being, driving Lyft and other contract apps, I've had knives and guns pulled on me, as well as people having tried to fight me, rob me, and all kinds of other things. Now this motel was on the street that I'd mentioned before, and homeless people were everywhere. There was a dude on the far corner of the complex that still had a needle in his arm, and was passed out against the building. I'm a big fan of true crime and horror narration, so I was on edge. My Lyft fare got his key, and the whole motel is ground level, so to help the guy out I drove him to his door. As I'd mentioned before, he had a lot of stuff, so I started to help him unload it, and on my second trip on getting more stuff, I noticed a guy come out of a room just to the south of my car and followed by two ladies. They came up to the room I was next to, not my passengers, and one of the ladies pounded on the door, then opened it. That's when I saw the guy raise a shotgun up out of his long coat and storm into the room. The two ladies followed him, slamming the door behind them. Following that, I heard a lot of yelling and shouting, and was just waiting for shots to ring out. Then out of nowhere, my passenger came up behind me. "I can take this, man. Go ahead and take off. Have a Merry Christmas." And he gave me a cash tip. I hadn't even noticed he'd taken the boxes out of my hands, or slid a $5 bill in my pocket. I was frozen. I think I knew what may have been going down in that room, but I had to leave, or at least get to where I could get my gun. I know the guys, and both ladies saw me, and I know they knew I saw that gun, so I had to get out of there. You know, no witnesses. I got in my car and sped away quickly, and when I'd gotten a block or so away, I called the cops and gave them every detail. After I got off the phone, I signed out of Lyft. I hadn't made much money, but I was done. I got a call later that night after the cops had investigated, but they never found the gunman or the woman, and they'd never answered the door that I'd seen them come out of, and the occupants of the room they went into said nothing happened. That was absolute bullcrap. I know what I saw. So, I died when my grandpa told me this story. He's in his late 90s, and back in the late 1930s, early 40s, he worked as an ambulance driver, and he put that in quotes when he told this story, because ambulances weren't as widely used or successful back then. He described it like a van, hearse type of thing, that a bunch of young teens would pick up bodies in to either transport them to the morgue or the hospital. Well, this job wasn't regulated, and on this particular day, my grandpa and his co-workers were at a bar drinking on the job, waiting for the signal to go to pick someone up. They eventually got the call to go to a car wreck scene, so they drunkenly left the bar. When they arrived, a man had been hit by a vehicle and was laying in the street, presumed dead or close to it. They got him on the gurney and began their drive back to the hospital, and of course there were other vehicles on the road with them. Well, because they were all pretty drunk, they hadn't secured the back doors, and when they hit a bump, the back doors of the transport vehicle flew open and the half-dead man flew out, still on the gurney, and into the open road. He was then run over a second time by the car following the ambulance. My grandpa and his co-workers all stared in disbelief at each other, when my grandpa said, "Well, if he wasn't dead before, he sure is now." They scraped up the mutilated body of this man off the road and still took him to the hospital. They didn't tell their higher-ups that he had fallen out of the vehicle, and the man's death was ruled as accidental rather than negligence. The hospital thought he had only been hit by the initial first car. My grandpa was laughing his head off at this story, so I can't imagine the other stuff he's seen. I was so shocked and thought that the guy might have been as old as my grandpa now if they hadn't forgotten to shut the doors correctly. About 5 years ago, I took a trip to Europe, and I had been working at a cooking school in Italy for about 2 months at this point. I was with my dad's cousin, who I had only met once before that, so I had essentially been in Europe without knowing anyone at all. Now, we had been fortunate enough to get a week off from work, so we decided to hop on a plane and go to Barcelona. After 2 days, my cousin suggested we drive up to Madrid, but wanting to make the most of my trip, I declined and made my way to Ireland instead. I spent 2 days in Dublin, getting drunk by myself, before hopping on a plane to Amsterdam. Now at this point, I had been completely by myself for almost 3 days. I'm a pretty big guy, so I wasn't too concerned about being in a foreign country by myself, and so far from anyone I knew. However, I was bored. I'm not the outgoing type, so I spent most of my time just walking around the red light district. My hostel was right outside of it, so I remained close to the action. I must have walked down every street in that area the day that I got there, and it had started to snow and rain on my first full day, so I decided to find something to do indoors. I'd walked maybe a mile away from my hotel to a museum, and the area around it was pretty desolate in relation to the red light district. When I left the museum, the weather had cleared up a bit, so I started my journey back to the RLD to continue exploring. As I turned back onto the sidewalk in front of the museum, I noticed a man walking in my direction and right in line with my path. I moved to my left so that we could pass each other, but he moved back into my path. As we got close enough that we would have walked right into each other, he made a stabbing gesture, letting out an "ah" noise as he touched my gut. This was all in a fluid motion as he was walking. I thought this was extremely weird and turned around to make sure the guy had kept on walking, which thankfully he had. I put the experience behind me and walked back towards the RLD, and I grabbed a coffee and tried to stay near my hotel. A few hours later, as the sun was setting, I saw the creep from earlier. He appeared to be hiding in a doorway of a church that was right across from my hotel. As I was watching this guy, I noticed he was looking at me. Has he been following me since the museum? By now he had to have noticed that I was completely alone, and aside from my blonde hair, I was clearly a tourist. Was this guy looking to rob me, or worse? I got up to throw away my coffee cup, noticing that this guy is watching my every move. Now I had 2 choices. I could go further into the RLD to try to lose this guy within the crowds of people, or I could go to my hotel room. I chose the latter for 2 reasons. 1, I didn't want to lose sight of this guy. He could have easily blended into the crowd whilst keeping an eye on me. And 2, I felt like I'd be safer in the hotel, as it was very nice and required a stop at the front desk to get to the elevators. The whole experience was very strange, and I probably wouldn't have even noticed this guy if he hadn't pretended to stab me a few hours earlier. I live in an apartment centered in a cluster of 3-story buildings and surrounded by woods and roads. It has never been a great place to live, but it wasn't the worst either. I moved in here in hopes of starting a family, which failed, but that's a story for another day. Next to my place, my mother lived in an exact copy of my apartment house, and I would visit her on a daily basis due to her persistent hounding of me to do so. And in the apartment next to hers lived a man we shall call Brad. You see, Brad used to go to special school due to his severe autism. He would get help from a social worker, and on occasion they would come by and clean his apartment for him. He would always say hello and smile brightly, correcting his glasses as he told us the importance of bowling. But he was alone and could sadly not find love very easily. He was a homosexual, and having problems with his social skills made it hard for him to get a man. So when my mother saw another man kiss Brad on the cheek, it made her very happy. But then this new man would start visiting Brad, despite seeming to have a wife and a child, which eventually both started living in Brad's apartment. They would greet us with a polite smile and tell us in detail how they came to our country only a year ago, and would randomly tell us detailed personal things about themselves. They would open the door to Brad's apartment every time we walked up to my mum's apartment, just to talk, even suggesting for us to join them at church. We declined as neither of us are religious, and the man would on occasion knock on my door, supposedly by mistake, thinking it was Brad's apartment. And one time he stood in the hallway after I'd forgotten to lock the door by mistake. Brad then started to write to me on Facebook, complaining how they'd keep moving his books or would borrow money and never give it back. I told him to either tell them to pay him or move out, but he'd simply reply with a thumbs up, and I wouldn't see him until a week later when we were on our way to go bowling. He seemed more cheerful than usual, as we'd promised to take a look at his new bike when he gets home with it tomorrow. But 2 days later, we suddenly heard a blood-curdling scream coming from their apartment, and I saw what I thought was a woman run across the grass field outside and vanish amongst the buildings. I wrapped myself in a blanket and went out onto the balcony, hoping to see the person who'd run off. All was quiet until an hour later, when I heard someone arguing outside. It was the smiling man on the phone with someone, and another man who seemed to be in some kind of distress, who was screaming into the phone for someone to come. I walked out onto my balcony again, which wasn't too high up, and I asked what was wrong. The person, Brad is dead, the man cried, now on his knees. The smiling man, not showing any emotion, kept speaking to the person on the phone and asked me, "Where are we?" Lavender Road, 66 at 7744. Why?" The smiling man repeated it, and it would take 15 minutes for an ambulance and the police to show up. At 4 a.m. the police knocked on my door to ask questions, and I could only tell them what I knew. Later on I went online to find Brad's cousin. I was completely terrified, and asked if she would go and check on Brad. She got mad at me, saying that Brad wasn't dead and she was going to block me. I felt guilty. Perhaps I was wrong. But sadly, no. After weeks of rumors between neighbors, it was officially confirmed. Brad had been killed, in the most gruesome way you could imagine. And who do you think did it? The smiling man. He denied it, of course, saying it was what Brad wanted. It was apparently a sex game that had gone wrong, ultimately ending in his life. A newspaper would later publish pictures of a reenactment of the crime, depicting him being tied down with weights on ropes around his neck, plus other things that I can't write down here. It clearly was no sex game. The story went that Brad and this man had a sexual relationship, but because of his faith it would be an issue if he was caught with another man. They used Brad for his money and accommodation, living rent-free, and he would also send letters to my mother asking for her help. Thankfully, the man got 15 years and was sent home to his native country and barred from entering this one forever. He tried to get it overturned, but it didn't happen. The evidence towards him was stacked up. I was asked if I wanted protection too, but I said no, as I was pretty sure that he wouldn't be back. Hey there, it's me again, Miss Fearsome. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Also, check out my new YouTube membership levels for some exclusive perks. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.